So looking at some of the attack vectors that we see in networks and kind of where things are coming, and to explain some types of attacks, I thought we'd start with a discussion on really why we've seen these increase in attacks over the past several years. Well, first off, of course, we have this reliance on computer networks and access to data. So we want to access data anywhere we're at, and we want it quickly, and we want to be able to do whatever we want with it. So we have this idea of the cloud, again, this data always being available wherever we're at, not having to jump through a lot of hoops to get there. And of course using our mobile devices as well. So having access everywhere from any device that we have. Social networking as well, this reliance on the network and being able to access anything from anywhere. BYOD is a new term in corporate IT. The idea in the past was that for security reasons we would never let someone bring their own device and plug it into our network because we couldn't secure it, so we were trusting their devices. So in the past, IT professionals would say, no, you're not allowed to plug your laptop into our network or your phone or anything like that. Nowadays the idea here is kind of shifted, and companies are saying, well gosh, if people are willing to pay for their own devices, let's let them into the network and just make sure that we can secure them enough that things are going to be relatively secure. So because of this, we have a problem or a threat as well, allowing people to bring their own devices into our networks. And then the last one I have listed here is this idea that we like to be able to monitor and do remote control of devices all over the world. So we have a company and we have a site somewhere in the middle of nowhere in Antarctica. So rather than having to fly someone up there or station someone up there to keep track of the device up there, whatever we have, instead we hook up the device to the network so that we can monitor it from far away or control it. And we do this with industrial factories as well, so we can control kind of all the conditions and things that are going on within that industrial environment. Again, putting these devices in places where it would be expensive or hard for humans to access all the time. So we have all of our power grids and our water supply and all these things. We have these sensors out there that have to be attached to the network. And then the other reason is the hacker knowledge required. So in the past, hackers had to be very, very smart. They had to know the tricks and tools to be able to circumvent any defenses that were up. But nowadays there's lots of scripts out there, lots of pre-programmed applications where what we call script kiddies are people that aren't very skilled at doing hacking and can just download an application, point it at what they want to attack and press a button, and it'll do the attacks for them. So we're seeing this increase because of the lessening of hacker knowledge required to do some of these hacks. So our goals with network security is confidentiality, to keep the data confidential, availability, to make sure that those who should have access to the data get access to the data or get access to the device that they're trying to get access to, and integrity, that the data that someone's trying to access is actually the data and it has not been compromised. So we have some different types of attacks. We have reconnaissance, which is the idea of getting into a system or network just to gather information about that network, what types of resources are there, what types of data is there, etc. And then after that, obviously, is the actual attack. Once the reconnaissance has happened, to figure out where the defenses are, how to circumvent them, where the prizes are, etc., then the actual attack comes. We have structured attacks and unstructured attacks. So structured is a hacker who has a specific goal in mind. They're hacking GE aircraft engines to steal some intellectual property. So they have a specific goal in mind that they're going after. And then the other type is unstructured. So unstructured attacks, the hacker really has no specific goal in mind. They're just out to hack anybody that they can. So any kind of free and open network, they're going to try to attack that. Of course, there are different strategies for defending both of these types of attacks. We have external attacks is what we generally think of, but we actually have a lot of instances of internal attacks as well. So people within the organization, they have the opportunity and access already, and then they use that to attack from within. We have network attacks and host attacks. So a host is just a computer or some kind of device on the network, right? So it has an operating system. So they're obviously, a hacker can hack a specific server that holds some data that they want, or they can hack the network, obviously most of the time to get into the hosts, but they can hack these devices, these routers, these switches, these wireless access points, to enable them to get access or to cause a disruption in the legitimate traffic on the network. So the price of attack is hopefully pretty obvious to most people. For corporate espionage, so the idea of stealing intellectual property, of getting a leg up on competition, etc. For individuals, identity theft, or a loss, a stealing of money from banks, etc. For corporations, lost revenues, lost prestige if it gets out there that you've been hacked, lost productivity from having to track down what's going on and then to fix it, and then obviously more recently we're concerned with physical harm. So having these devices that are on the network that are controlling things like our devices in the hospital or power or water supply, etc. If we have hacks against those, then we can actually have physical harm come. Some types of attacks. So packet sniffing is a fairly common type of attack, and that's more of a reconnaissance effort. So packet sniffing, if you remember from the videos, we send packets across the network. So depending on how the network is set up, someone can actually sit near that system and just grab copies of the packets as they go by and look inside of them to see what's happening. So this is pretty common, say, on wireless networks, because anyone who's connected to that wireless access point can sniff the traffic and see the packets that are going from other systems through that wireless access point, and not just their own traffic. So we have to be wary of this packet sniffing going on. Password attacks, so this is probably the most common thing that people think of with hacking. So the idea that a hacker is actually cracking a password on a server or perhaps on a device in the network. And there are a number of different ways that they can do this. They can do, one way is called a brute force attack or a dictionary attack. And this is just a matter of having a computer program run through any combination of letters and characters to try to guess the password. And depending on how long or complex the password is, this can take just a few seconds or upwards of maybe an hour if it's complex. But the idea here is that almost any password can be hacked if that attacker actually wants to get in there and has the tools to do so. Other types of way for password attacks is, actually guessing it based on a specific user or finding out information about an administrator. Or another common one is using default passwords, especially on network equipment. So you can go on the internet and look up a specific type of a router and find out what the default password is. And a lot of inexperienced administrators will simply keep that default password on these devices. A DOS, a denial of service attack. So the idea here is that you're disrupting someone else's network. So you're causing the systems to interact with you rather than interact with legitimate traffic. So a denial of service attack is to send a lot of fake traffic to a network or perhaps to a web server, and so it overruns that server. So it's constantly replying to the bad requests, and so it can't spend its time replying to the legitimate traffic. So this is pretty common, and more specifically, we have distributed denial of service, which is a DDoS. And what that is utilizing multiple different computers to attack a single point to cause this increase of traffic or this increased response of that device or server. Man-in-the-middle attack, this is where the hacker actually gets between the client and the server and intercepts the data, changes it before it gets to its intended recipient. And so we can do things for changing the actual data that's going across the lines. Malware is this idea of virus or a Trojan that you infect a computer with, and with that Trojan or that virus or that malware, you can do things like denial of service. You can use it to grab passwords, perhaps usernames from that system. There are all number of things that these malware can do. Now, botnet is generally a group of computers that have been infected with malware. So we have thousands of computers that are participating in a botnet, and it happens when a host gets infected with some piece of malware. Then we have a bot master, so we have some hacker who then takes control of these thousands of computers that are within this botnet, and these botnets can then be used for a denial of service attack, to try to crack passwords or whatever. But basically we have this botnet master, this hacker at centralized control, who's then telling these thousands of infected computers out there to act on their behalf to attack some other network or system. And this is pretty common nowadays. So we have, if you have your computers running slow, it's a good chance that it's participating in a botnet. And so this is pretty common. And again, these hackers can control these things. They sell access to the botnet. So a lot of times they can be used for criminal purposes to sell the use of the botnet to other hackers who want to attack some other network or site. Phishing, I think most people understand, is this idea of trying to fool someone through email or chatting or something like that to try to get you to send money, or to try to get you to go to a website that's going to infect your system, put malware on your system. A software vulnerability, this is just some code in an application that hasn't been written very securely that allows hackers to get into the application, take control of the server, etc. And oftentimes these software vulnerabilities come out as what's called a zero-day attack. A zero-day attack is some vulnerability in a piece of software or an operating system that until that time was not known. And so because of that, once the word gets out about this vulnerability, there can be a lot of hacks at one time until the network administrators can come, or the software developers can come and fix that hole. Social engineering is the idea that we tend to want to help other people. This is our behavior. So social engineering is playing on that want for people to help people. So the idea is the hacker will perhaps call a company and claim to be part of the IT staff, that they had forgotten their password, or try to get somebody's name. So the idea is that they're using this for reconnaissance by playing on people's want to help other people. Advanced persistent threat. So the advanced persistent threat is kind of this structured attack, this idea that some hacker has its sights on a specific piece of information or on a specific target that they're going after, and they're going to continue to hack that network or that system until they get what they want. They're not going to move on to something else. They have a specific target in mind. War driving is a type of attack whereby someone is driving around, or a neighborhood or a shopping mall, something like that, and they're looking for wireless access that's not been secured properly. and then once they find it, can then go inside of that network and attack the systems within. So a relatively common one is a year or two ago, someone was doing some war driving and found, I think it was TJ Maxx stores, their wireless networks were not very secure. And so the hackers were able to hack into the network and grab credit card numbers as they went across their point of sale system. So war driving is simply sniffing for unsecured networks and then accessing those wireless networks. So how do some common ways to defend some of these things, or some technologies? The perimeter of the network is just that. So it's how traffic goes in and out of the network. So the perimeter would be here at the edge routers here, wherever we have access to the outside world. Here we have access to the internet here, and through a phone line would be part of the perimeter as well. So any place where we're having access to the larger network would be the perimeter that we have to then secure. Border router is just that. It's the router that sits on the perimeter where the traffic goes in and out. Firewall. So they talked a little bit about this in the Warriors of the Net video, but a firewall is something that exists on the network to only allow certain traffic in and out. So here we have a firewall here on the edge of the network, and so what it does is allows mainly just traffic going out of the network. Any traffic coming into the network has to be of a certain type. It has to have been requested from the inside. It has to be only going to public-facing servers. So here we have the web server of this school district, which is accessible, but say some of these devices would not be accessible from the outside world unless those resources were requested. So for instance, if I have a computer over here and I was accessing a website, say google.com, which is out here on the internet somewhere, then I would send the request out the firewall, and when it would come back, it would say, hey, Mark requested this information, and the firewall would see that it was requested from within, so it would send it to that computer. But on the other hand, if the server or a device out here would try to come to the firewall and say, hey, I want to access Mark's device, it would see that it was not requested and block that information. And so we can set up a lot of these firewall rules to allow certain type of traffic past that firewall and disallow certain type of traffic from coming through the firewall. And we can set up different rules on both sides of the firewall. An IDS-IPS. So an IDS-IPS is an intrusion detection system, intrusion prevention system. And what these are devices that we stick on our network that basically listen to all the traffic. So the firewall looks at kind of packet by packet. Sometimes it looks at a range of them. But generally, a firewall is not smart enough to see patterns in the traffic, to see when traffic is different than it normally is. And so what we do is put these devices throughout the network to find out, okay, what type of traffic is coming through here, so we can keep an eye on what's normal, what's not normal, etc. So we can kind of put a, it's kind of like a canary in the mines. It tells us when the canary dies that we've got a problem and we need to get out, right? So the IDS is similar, that we can place that through our network at certain points to find out, okay, what traffic is trying to get into our firewall, or on this side perhaps, what traffic is getting into our firewall, so we can look at patterns to find out, okay, is this normal, is this not normal? An IPS is an intrusion protection system, and that will actually take action and stop traffic that it sees as not normal, whereas IDS simply reports to administrators. A VPN. So VPN creates a secure tunnel, virtual private network, between two different networks, or from a client to the network. And generally, again, this is, so let's say this is our VPN server. And so if we have someone from our school out on the internet, say at Panera Bread, where it's wireless and not a secure network, what they can do is connect to the corporate VPN, and it'll create a secure tunnel between that client and the corporate network. So those users around them in Panera now will not be able to see the traffic coming through. And we can also have a VPN between sites. So in this instance, we have multiple sites here between the internet. We could set up a VPN between this site and this site to make sure that we have a tunnel over the internet which can be open for people to see, so that we have secure traffic going between our sites. A DMZ is a demilitarized zone, and so if we go back to our networks here, the DMZ is here where we have public-facing servers. So we have our web server, our VPN server. They need to be able to be accessed from the outside. So we have a less secure area of the firewall here. So it allows more traffic to come this way than it does to go into the network. So this would be our demilitarized zone here, this idea of some publicly facing servers out to the internet. Alright, the switch network, what we're talking about here is this idea of having switches in our networks. So we talked about that these switches here are what we connect our clients to. If we look at this one, it's a little better picture of the different types of switches. So we talked about in the last videos that we have these core switches connected to distribution switches, which actually then go out to our access switches, which our clients are connected to, right? So we utilize these switches now because it allows for secure traffic. So when this computer accesses this server, it's sending its traffic along the line to the switch and up through the series of switches without these other computers connected to the switch being able to sniff the traffic. And that's different than in the old days we used hubs, and these hubs would allow you to sniff the traffic going across just like the wireless does. I talked about that the problem with wireless devices is that it allows us to sniff the traffic. So we utilize switches so we're guarding against that sniffing or that snooping from happening. A honeypot. So a honeypot's something a little bit different. So in the past, companies or organizations would simply try to protect their networks, right? Just keep people or keep hackers, keep unwanted traffic from getting in. They wouldn't do anything on the offensive or anything like that. But what's happening now is companies are starting to put up what's called a honeypot. A honeypot is simply a server that you put perhaps on the edge of your networks here in the DMZ, and you make them so they're not very secure at all, with the idea being you try to lure the hackers into that server. So let's say this is our honeypot, and we do that to gain information about the hackers so we can find out where they're coming from, so we can then put a rule on our firewall to prevent them from coming in. We find out kind of what they're doing next. So we do this to really get an understanding of what the hackers are, what they're after, etc. And so again, that's a honeypot. A honeypot is any computer or server that you set up with the intention of luring hackers into. And again, you can find out information about what they're doing. It also can lure them away from your primary servers so that they're not getting into the important information on your network. And you might think, well, that kind of sounds like entrapment. Well, it's not entrapment because we're not using it in a law enforcement manner. So only law enforcement can be having problems with entrapment. Now, the problem that it can have is if a hacker takes control over your honeypot, it can then be used to attack other systems in your network or other networks. So you have to be kind of careful with these honeypots. Penetration testing is the idea of having people within your own IT staff or hiring consultants to try to penetrate or hack into your network. And what that will do is they'll be able to try to hack into your network and tell you this router over here is not secure. I was able to hack in, and this is how I was able to do it. So it gives us information about where we have holes in our network or in systems that we can then go and patch before the hackers get access to them. Encryption is the idea that we're taking our data and we're scrambling the data so it's unreadable by someone from the outside. So we utilize encryption in a couple different ways. We talked about a VPN before. That uses encryption to encrypt traffic as it goes across a network. So we can set up our VPN server here, and it encrypts the traffic between our system over here at Panera through the network to the system here, so that the people around us can't snoop, and even if they get the data, they're not going to be able to make any sense of it. We can also use encryption to save files onto a disk. So if we encrypt it, when we save it, if somebody were able to uncover that data, again, they would just see gibberish unless they had the proper encryption key. ACL is an access control list. It's simply a way to specify what users have access to what resources. So we can specify in our network here that only the administrators have access to configure these routers. We can say the certain internal users can access these servers, but outside users cannot. Or we can say that the IT staff can create users, but only certain administrators can alter the servers in some way. We could say that marketing has access to read these files, but accounting has access to read and change the files. So those are access control lists, a list of who has access and what type of access to what resources. Multi-factor authentication. So authentication generally is a password, but passwords can be not very secure. We talked about how hackers can pretty quickly and easily guess or find out passwords. So multi-factor authentication forces a user to not only have one level of authentication, say a password, but also forces them to have another layer of authentication. So whether that's a security badge, maybe an iris scan, a fingerprint, emailing you to say, you're trying to access, click this to assure that you want access. So multi-factor authentication is going beyond simply using just a password to tell the system that you are who you are. Host hardening is the idea of installing patches on our hosts, on our computers, turning off the services that we don't need that could cause a hole into that system, etc. So it's really just tuning our operating system down, only have it running the things we absolutely need, because the other things, if they're running, could be a hole that a hacker could get into. Alright, so that's the video on the specific types of attacks and some common technologies that we use in network security to stop them.